Behind the shining walls of ancient Japan, there was a horrifying truth that history never wanted you to know. Young boys were forced into palaces, turned into male concubines, stripped of their innocence, and trapped in a life of humiliation. In silence, their suffering was hidden for centuries, but today their voices will finally be heard. What really happened inside those secret chambers, and why did no one dare to speak of it? Watch till the very end to uncover this buried truth. And if you want more shocking untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss them. In the glittering courts of ancient Japan, where cherry blossoms fell like pink rain and the sound of koto strings echoed through painted wooden halls, there existed a world most people never spoke of openly. Behind the shining armor of samurai, in the graceful steps of geishas was a darker, hidden reality, one where young men were chosen, not for battle, not for poetry, but for their bodies, their beauty, and their submission. They were known as male concubines, and their lives, though draped in silk, were chains of humiliation, exploitation, and pain. This was a world that outwardly appeared refined, a society that prided itself on honor, ritual, and loyalty. Yet within the shoshi screens of noble palaces, boys were stripped of dignity to serve desires that had nothing to do with love. The origins of this disturbing practice lay in the structure of Japanese court and samurai society. For centuries, sexuality in Japan was viewed differently than in many parts of the world. Male companionship, relationships between men, and even the eroticization of youthful beauty were deeply tied into culture, especially among the warrior elite. The samurai code of wakashudo, the way of the young, established bonds between older men and adolescent boys. And while some accounts painted these bonds as based on mentorship and loyalty, many spiraled into physical exploitation. For young boys pulled into this system, it was less about honor and more about surviving in a world where refusal was not an option. Imagine being a boy of 12 or 13, taken from a poor farming family, perhaps sold by desperate parents who saw no other way to feed their children. He might have been promised an education in the arts, training in etiquette, or the chance to serve nobility, but once within the wooden halls of Kyoto or Edo's castles, reality would strike. He was no longer his own. His body, his every gesture, his obedience belonged to men far more powerful than he could ever imagine. In the court of a shogun or a powerful daimyo, concubines were selected for their looks, delicate features, soft skin, and the appearance of youth. Male concubines were often dressed in fine robes, sometimes even painted and adorned in ways that blurred the line between genders. This was not just about beauty, it was about control. Their very identities were stripped and remade to suit the fantasies of the lords they served. These boys were forbidden from speaking too freely, from refusing advances, from expressing their own pain. Every smile they showed was trained, every bow rehearsed, every glance calculated to please. Daily life for a male concubine was a performance. By day, he might be instructed in music, calligraphy, or dance skills meant to entertain the master. During formal gatherings, he might pour sake with trembling hands, kneel on tatami mats as poets recited verses, or sing with an almost ghostly grace. But by night, when the lanterns flickered low and the palace corridors echoed with silence, his real purpose became clear. He was summoned into chambers not as a guest, not as a companion, but as an object. His worth was measured not in his heart, but in how much satisfaction he could provide to men who viewed him as disposable. The psychological toll was immense. These boys were caught in a paradox: given luxury, yet denied freedom. They wore silk but felt the weight of invisible chains. They ate delicacies, yet swallowed grief every night. Some, in their quiet suffering, left behind fragments of poems or diary notes, words that revealed not pleasure but deep despair. One boy wrote of looking at the moon from behind barred palace windows, longing for a life where he could simply run in the fields, away from the suffocating rituals of the court. His words echoed a truth, that even amidst luxury, the human soul cannot survive without dignity. The rulers and lords who kept concubines often justified it with tradition. They argued it was part of culture, that it strengthened bonds between master and servant, that it was an extension of beauty and art. But beneath those polished justifications was a brutal reality. Power and lust, wrapped in ritual. A young boy had no choice when summoned. His tears were silenced, his protests ignored. Some resisted at first, only to face beatings or public humiliation until they submitted completely. Others learned to adapt, masking pain behind carefully rehearsed smiles. This practice was not isolated to one era. From the Heian period through the Edo period, different forms of male concubinage existed. In the lavish courts of the Heian aristocracy, beauty was worshipped almost as a religion. Poems described delicate faces, soft gestures, and fleeting moments of intimacy. But what the poets left unsaid was the suffering of those forced into those roles. In the militarized world of the samurai, these relationships took on darker tones, and service were demanded not just on the battlefield, but in the bedroom. For the shoguns, concubines became symbols of power, proof that they could command not just armies but also human lives at their whim. And yet, within this shadowy existence, bonds did form. Some concubines clung to each other, whispering secrets at night, sharing stolen moments of comfort. They were brothers in suffering, bound not by choice, but by circumstance. There are accounts of deep affection growing between concubines and even of desperate attempts to escape together. But escape was almost impossible. Guards patrolled the estates, and punishment for running away was severe, sometimes even fatal. The tragedy of the male concubine was that he was erased from history, while emperors and shoguns had their names carved into chronicles, and noblewomen were immortalized in poetry. The concubine remained a shadow. He existed only in whispers, in rumors, in fleeting references that rarely named him. Society consumed his youth and beauty, and when he grew older, when his features hardened, when his body no longer suited the desires of the court, he was discarded. Some were given minor positions as servants, others thrown back into poverty, and many simply disappeared from the records altogether. Imagine the fear of a boy watching another concubine being dismissed, knowing his own day would come. Beauty was both his curse and his prison. Every day he woke up, he knew his survival depended on keeping that beauty intact. Unpleasing men, who would never see him as an equal. And when the first signs of aging appeared, a shadow of facial hair, a deepening of the voice, a wrinkle near the eye, he knew his value was fading. That awareness gnawed at him, a reminder that he was nothing more than a passing toy in the grand games of power. Part of what made this system so cruel was the silence around it. Families who gave up their sons rarely knew the full truth of what awaited them. Society turned a blind eye, pretending it was art, culture, or tradition. And the boys themselves had no voice. They were trained not to speak of what happened, not to question, not to resist. Generations passed, and their stories remained hidden behind layers of shame and secrecy. The life of a male concubine in ancient Japan was, in essence, the theft of innocence. Behind the lantern-lit corridors, the rituals, the music, and the poetry was a story of exploitation. These boys were denied the chance to be children, to grow freely, to love freely. Their lives became a stage upon which others projected their fantasies, while their own dreams withered in silence. And yet, in this silence, a haunting question remains. How many of them longed for freedom? How many dreamed of escape, of walking under the open sky without fear? How many left this world unheard, their cries drowned out by the sound of drums and flutes in noble courts? History may not give us all the answers, but the fragments we do have tell us enough, that theirs was a life of sorrow, hidden beneath silken shadows. The corridors of Edo Castle, dimly lit by flickering paper lanterns, carried secrets the world outside was never meant to hear. Behind its towering walls, shoguns wielded unimaginable power over armies, power over life and death, and even power over the most intimate parts of a young boy's existence. For in the heart of this empire, male concubinage was not merely rumor. It was a carefully veiled reality, hidden under layers of ritual and silence. To understand the suffering of these boys, one must first understand the structure of power in ancient Japan. At the very top stood the emperor, a spiritual figure, but by the medieval and early modern periods, true authority rested with the shogun, the supreme military ruler. Beneath him were daimyo, lords of vast domains, and beneath them the samurai, warriors bound by strict codes of loyalty. The hierarchy was rigid, leaving little space for ordinary people to choose their own path. And within this system, concubines, whether male or female, were treated as possessions, status, symbols, tokens of wealth and authority. The existence of male concubines was often tied to the tradition of wakashudo, the way of youths. This practice, deeply ingrained in samurai culture, justified intimate relationships between older men and adolescent boys. It was said to be about mentorship, teaching loyalty and courage. But the truth, for many, was that it blurred into coercion and exploitation. A boy brought into a noble household as a page or attendant could soon find himself trapped in a role he never imagined, forced to serve his lord in ways that went far beyond honor. Consider the life of a boy named Haruto, born to a struggling farming family in the countryside. He was sent to the capital at the age of 12 to serve in the household of a daimyo. His parents believed it an opportunity, better food, a chance to rise in society, perhaps even a future as a samurai. For the first few weeks, Haruto marveled at the palace. He learned to bow correctly, to walk silently on tatami floors, to recite poems when asked. He dressed in robes finer than anything he had seen at home. But soon the summons came, whispered by older servants. The Lord wanted him in his private chambers. Haruto did not understand at first, but he quickly learned what his new duty meant. That night, innocence was taken from him, and with it, the belief that his life was his own. Haruto's story was not unique. Many boys like him endured nights of fear, days of rehearsed obedience, and years of silent submission. They were trained not only in art and etiquette, but also in how to conceal pain, how to maintain an appearance of calm while suffering inside. Some boys were praised as favorites and given jewels, poems written in their honor, or positions of apparent prestige. Yet behind the glittering facade, they were still prisoners. Every smile was forced. Every compliment from their master carried the weight of expectation, reminding them of the price they had to pay to survive. In the shogunate's records, mentions of such concubines are scarce, often erased by history's selective memory, but in hidden diaries, whispers remain. Some samurai, reflecting in later years, wrote of the youths of the palace, boys who served in ways too shameful to describe openly. One courtier admitted in a secret letter that these boys were decorations by day, sacrifices by night. The very language revealed the cruelty human beings reduced to ornaments, their dignity consumed for the pleasure of the powerful. But beyond the emotional torment, there was also a physical toll. Concubines often faced abuse, their bodies bruised and broken. Medical scrolls from the Edo period describe boys with unexplained injuries, dismissed as accidents or illness. In reality, these wounds came from nights of violence, inflicted by men who believed their rank placed them above morality. The boys had no protection, no voice, no justice. Even when their suffering was obvious, silence was enforced. Speaking out was unthinkably meant disgrace, punishment, even death. Perhaps most haunting of all was the way these boys were discarded once their youth faded. In the world of the court, beauty was fleeting currency. As soon as a boy's features grew sharper, as his body matured, he was no longer desired. Many concubines were cast aside, given lowly tasks, or sent away entirely. Some fell into poverty, their only skills those taught for the amusement of nobles, skills useless in the harsh world outside the palace. Others tried to cling to relevance by serving as attendants or guards, but the stigma of their past followed them everywhere. They were marked by whispers, by shame, by memories that never left. The cruelty of this system was compounded by its secrecy. Unlike female concubinage, which was sometimes acknowledged and even celebrated in stories, male concubinage was shrouded in silence. Society refused to see it. Families pretended not to know, and the boys themselves were forced into invisibility. This erasure from history added another layer of tragedy. Not only were their lives stolen, but their voices were silenced forever. Yet within this darkness, there were small acts of resistance. Some concubines forged bonds of friendship, comforting one another in stolen moments. A few wrote poetry, their words thinly veiled cries for freedom. One such poem, hidden in a temple archive, reads, "By day I smile, a doll of painted grace. By night I vanish, swallowed by shadows. The moon sees me, but the world does not. Will I ever wake from this endless dream?" These fragile verses reveal a truth that history tried to bury, that concubines were not willing participants in a tradition, but victims of a system built on power and silence. The story of concubinage in Japan was not limited to the palaces of Kyoto or Edo. It extended into monasteries, where some Buddhist monks also engaged in the practice of taking young acolytes as companions. Again, cloaked in the language of mentorship and discipline, the reality was exploitation. A young boy seeking spiritual guidance might instead find himself trapped in another kind of servitude, forced into roles he could not escape. Even in the pleasure districts of cities like Edo, male youths were sold into brothels to serve elite clients. These boys were often disguised in elaborate makeup and robes, presented almost as androgynous figures. Customers, both men and women, paid to spend time with them, but for the boys, it was yet another prison. Many died young from disease, abuse, or despair, their bodies discarded like broken toys. What makes the history of male concubinage especially haunting is the way it was woven into systems of honor and culture. To the outside world, Japan was a land of ritual, poetry, cherry blossoms, and swordsmanship. But behind the painted screens, power expressed itself in the most brutal ways. Boys were sacrificed on the altar of tradition, and their pain was silenced. In the name of beauty and loyalty, the shoguns and lords who kept concubines rarely faced consequences. Their actions were accepted as part of their privilege. Even when rumors spread, society looked away. The samurai code, which spoke so much of loyalty and honor, failed to protect the most vulnerable. And so, generation after generation, boys, like Haruto, suffered in silence, their lives consumed by a system that cared nothing for their humanity. But what happened when concubines grew older, when their time in the palace ended? Some were married off quietly, given wives and small stipends, as if to erase the shame of their past. Others became servants, fading into the background of the very households where they once held the most intimate role. A few tried to tell their stories, but their voices were drowned out by the weight of shame. And many, perhaps most, simply disappeared from history altogether. Their suffering reminds us that history is not just the story of emperors and generals, of battles and victories. It is also the story of those who were silenced, whose pain was hidden, whose lives were consumed by systems of power. The male concubines of ancient Japan may not have left monuments or legacies, but their shadows linger in the fragments of poetry, the whispers of diaries, the silences in official records. They remind us that behind the beauty of tradition lies a darker truth, a truth of exploitation, control, and forgotten voices. And so, As we look deeper into this hidden history, one question grows louder. Why did no one speak for them? Why did society, so obsessed with honor, allow such dishonor to exist in silence? The answers lie not only in history, but in human nature itself, the way power corrupts, the way desire blinds, the way silence protects the strong while destroying the weak. This was the world of the male concubine, silk on the outside, chains on the inside. A life where innocence was stolen, voices were silenced, and humanity was denied. And yet, by uncovering their stories now, centuries later, we honor them in a way their own world never did. The palaces of ancient Japan were like two different worlds, existing side by side. On the outside, they appeared majestic, filled with painted screens, gardens of cherry blossoms, and the sound of koto music drifting through the air. Visitors spoke of elegance, refinement, and beauty. But beyond those polished doors, another reality existed, one that was hidden in whispers and shadows. By the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shoguns ruled Japan with an iron grip, concubinage had become a system in itself. Male concubines, often young boys, were carefully selected, trained, and confined within the walls of the castle. For many of them, life was less about living and more about surviving. One of the most notorious examples of this hidden world was connected to Tokugawa Inobu, the sixth shogun of Japan, who reigned in the early 1700s. His court was filled with stories of favoritism and indulgence. Although the official records remain silent, secret writings from attendants mention that certain young boys were chosen to serve him privately. These boys were praised for their beauty, dressed in silken robes, and paraded in front of high-ranking guests as if they were treasures. Behind the scenes, however, their lives were controlled down to the smallest detail. They were not allowed to speak freely, they could not refuse commands, and they lived under the constant fear of punishment. One boy, whose name is lost to history but who appears in an anonymous diary, was described as having a face like the moon, soft and pale, with eyes that carried sorrow too deep for his years. This boy was taken into the palace at the age of 11. For 3 years he lived as a prized possession, forced to entertain, to sing, to serve in ways too painful to describe. When he reached the age of 14, his body began to change, and he was suddenly of no interest to the shogun. Without ceremony, he was dismissed. The diary notes that he was sent away with a small sum of money, and nothing else. No one knows what became of him, but his story reflects the cruel cycle every male concubine faced, valued only for youth, discarded as soon as maturity arrived. Another example comes from Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, often called the dog shogun because of his strange obsession with protecting animals. Tsunayoshi was known for his eccentric laws, but few people speak of his private life. Whispers in Edo spoke of his preference for young attendants. Some claimed he kept several boys in his inner chambers, hidden even from his closest advisors. If this was true, then the very man who issued laws to protect stray dogs showed little compassion for the boys trapped under his control. The contradiction was striking. Publicly, these rulers spoke of honor, duty, and the welfare of the people. Privately, they indulged in practices that robbed children of dignity and freedom. And because the shoguns were seen as untouchable, no one dared to challenge them. Life inside the palace for these boys was suffocating. They woke early, bathed, and dressed in layers of silk provided by their masters. Their hair was combed and styled to make them appear more delicate. They were taught music, poetry, and even the art of conversation, not for their own development, but to better please those who owned them. Every movement, every word, was carefully rehearsed. But at night, the palace walls became prisons. The boys were sent to the private quarters of the lords, where they endured acts they could never speak of. Some nights were filled with forced intimacy, others with violence. If a boy resisted, he was beaten. If he cried, he was mocked. The older concubines, who had once been through the same suffering, often warned the younger ones, "Do not cry, do not resist, it will only make things worse." One such concubine, recorded in a rare letter smuggled out of the palace, wrote, "We are not sons, we are not servants, we are shadows. Our bodies are not our own. The walls are our cage, and silence is our only friend." This letter was found centuries later in a temple archive, hidden among old scrolls. Its author remains unknown. But the words echoed the pain of countless boys whose stories never survived. The psychological toll was immense. Many concubines grew up never knowing real affection, only control and fear. Their identities were shaped entirely by the desires of others. Some began to believe that their suffering was normal, that their lives had no other purpose. Others dreamed of escape, but knew it was impossible. Where could a discarded concubine go? If they returned home, shame awaited them. If they ran away, they risked death, and so most remained, trapped in silence. In rare cases, concubines gained influence. A boy who became a favorite of the shogun could rise in status, sometimes even receiving titles or lands later in life. But this power came at a price. To the outside world, they might appear fortunate, yet in reality, their lives were still bound by the trauma of their youth. They were marked forever by what they endured. Beyond the shogunate, the practice of keeping male concubines extended into the daimyo households as well. Lords across Japan often mirrored the habits of the shogun, believing that keeping beautiful boys was a symbol of wealth and refinement. In some castles, entire wings were dedicated to concubines. Servants whispered of corridors filled with laughter during the day and cries at night. One account tells of a daimyo in Kyushu who kept a boy from the age of 10 until 16. The boy, forced into submission, eventually took his own life within the castle walls. The incident was covered up, reported as an illness. His family never learned the truth. The daimyo faced no consequences, and the cycle continued with another boy soon brought in to take his place. What makes this history even more tragic is the silence surrounding it. Unlike the tales of female courtesans, which were sometimes romanticized in literature and art, the lives of male concubines were rarely recorded. Painful memories were erased. Official documents ignored them. Families who lost their sons to such fates often pretended it never happened. Fearing shame, the boys became ghosts, existing only in whispers and shadows. And yet, traces of their presence remain. In some temples, paintings show young attendants dressed in fine robes, their faces strangely expressionless. In certain poems, references are made to moon-faced youths serving in palaces. Even in theater, the practice was hinted at through characters who embodied beauty and suffering. These fragments, though small, are the only evidence we have of lives erased by history's silence. But why did society allow this to continue? The answer lies in the rigid structures of power. In Japan's feudal system, loyalty to one's lord was absolute. Questioning the actions of a daimyo or shogun was unthinkable. Even if people knew the truth, they could do nothing. Silence was enforced, not just by fear, but by culture itself. The suffering of concubines was seen as a private matter, hidden behind the screens of the palace. For the boys themselves, the suffering did not end when they left the palace. Many carried the trauma throughout their lives. Some turned to drink, others to solitude. A few became cruel themselves, repeating the cycle with younger servants. The scars of their past shaped everything they did. Long after their concubine years ended, perhaps the most haunting part of this story is the loneliness. These boys, taken from their families, stripped of their childhoods, forced into silence, lived lives without love. Even when they were praised or showered with gifts, they knew it was not for who they truly were, but for what they represented: objects of desire, symbols of status. Their humanity was never seen. The silence of history makes their suffering even greater. Unlike warriors who died in battle, concubines left no heroic songs. Unlike rulers who built castles, they left no monuments. Their lives were consumed in secrecy, their pain erased by time. And yet, by piecing together the fragments that remain, we can see them not as shadows, but as human beings who deserved better in the end. The story of male concubinage in ancient Japan is not just about the cruelty of rulers. It is about the dangers of unchecked power, the silence of society, and the cost paid by the most vulnerable. These boys were sacrificed not for survival, not for war, but for the pleasure of the powerful. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all. The walls of Japan's ancient castles no longer echo with the whispers of concubines. The sliding paper doors that once hid their pain are now silent, preserved in museums and tourist sites. Visitors walk through these grand structures in awe, admiring the artwork, the gardens, and the history of the samurai. Yet very few realize that behind this beauty lies a story erased from memory. The horrific lives of the male concubines who once lived in their shadows. As time passed and the Tokugawa shogunate declined, Japan began to change. Western influence entered, the feudal order collapsed, and with it, many of the private practices of the lords and shoguns disappeared. But the scars of what had been done remained, carried in silence by those who survived. By the 19th century, when Japan was forced to open its doors to the West after centuries of isolation, concubinage, especially involving young boys, had become something to hide. The new leaders wanted to present Japan as a modern nation, civilized and strong. They abolished practices that embarrassed them and erased records that told uncomfortable truths. This was why so little evidence of male concubinage survived. It was deliberately forgotten, buried beneath layers of honor, nationalism, and pride. But silence does not mean absence. For every erased document, there were whispers passed down through families. For every destroyed diary, there were fragments left behind in poems, letters, or rumors. Slowly, historians began to uncover pieces of the truth, and what they found was disturbing. The forgotten voices of concubines revealed not only suffering, but also resilience. Some of these boys grew into men who, despite their trauma, found ways to survive. A few even rose to positions of power themselves, though their pasts haunted them. One record tells of a man who served as a high-ranking retainer in the late Edo period. He was once a concubine in his youth, but later became known for his cruelty toward young servants. People whispered that he was repeating the violence he had endured, unable to break free from the cycle. His story is tragic not only for him, but for those he hurt, in turn. Other concubines, however, sought peace in anonymity. Some became monks, retreating into the mountains to live quiet lives of prayer. One such man left a note in a temple, found years later, which read, "I was taken young, my childhood stolen. I gave my body, but my soul survived. Now I give what remains of me to the Buddha, that in the next life I may be free." These words, though few, are a reminder that even in suffering, there was hope. For many concubines, religion became the only refuge they could turn to when society offered none. Tragedy of the concubines also raises a painful question. Why did no one speak for them? Why were they left to suffer in silence? The answer lies in the culture of power and shame. Families who lost sons to this fate rarely spoke of it, for fear of dishonor. Servants who witnessed cruelty could not report it, for fear of death. And the concubines themselves were forced into silence, taught that their voices had no worth. In such an environment, their suffering was invisible, hidden behind a facade of beauty and elegance. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is the way society normalized it. In many circles, the keeping of male concubines was not seen as shocking or cruel. It was considered part of the culture of the elite. For the lords and shoguns, it was a display of wealth and power. For the boys, it was a life chosen for them, with no escape. Generations of children suffered because society accepted their pain as unworthy of concern. When Japan finally entered the modern age, these practices ended, but the memory of them was buried. School textbooks did not mention the concubines. Histories of the shoguns spoke of wars, politics, and reforms, but never of the young boys who lived and died in their palaces. It was as though they never existed. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to recover these forgotten stories, piecing together fragments of truth from the margins of history. And yet, even now, the subject remains uncomfortable. Many people prefer to speak of samurai honor, of cherry blossoms and noble traditions, rather than the dark realities hidden beneath. But without acknowledging the suffering of the concubines, our understanding of history remains incomplete. To remember only the glory and not the cruelty is to honor a false image of the past. Imagine for a moment the life of a single concubine, a boy of 10, taken from his family under promises of service. At first, he is dressed in fine robes, given good food, told that he is special. He believes, for a time, that he is fortunate. But soon, the reality sets in. His body is no longer his own. His nights are filled with fear, his days with training to please others. He cries at first, but learns to stop. He dreams of home, but knows he cannot return. As he grows older, he feels himself changing, and with every year, he comes closer to being discarded. At last, when his youth fades, he is sent away, forgotten, his worth gone. He leaves the palace not as the boy he once was, but as a hollow man, carrying scars no one can see. This was the reality for countless boys across Japan, and yet their names are lost. They were never honored, never remembered. Their lives ended, not with monuments, but with silence. Today, when we look back at Japan's history, we must not only admire its beauty, but also confront its cruelty. The story of the male concubines is a reminder that behind the polished image of the past, there were victims who suffered in silence. Their stories deserve to be told, not to shame the culture, but to give voice to those who had none. In a way, speaking of them now breaks the silence that has lasted for centuries. It allows us to see them not as shadows, but as human beings, children who laughed, cried, hoped, and feared, just like any other. By remembering them, we honor their humanity. The legacy of the concubines also carries lessons for the present. It warns us of the dangers of unchecked power, of cultures that silence victims, and of societies that value appearances over truth. These dangers are not confined to history. They exist even today, in different forms, in different places. By remembering the past, we can better protect the vulnerable in the present. The castles of Japan stand tall, even now, their walls preserved as symbols of history. Tourists walk through their gates, marveling at the architecture, the artwork, and the sense of stepping back in time. But perhaps, as they admire these places, they should pause to imagine the voices that once echoed there, the boys who lived and died in silence. Their laughter, their cries, their whispered prayers, all swallowed by the walls. If you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear them. The story of the male concubines is not one of beauty, but of tragedy. It is a story of stolen childhoods, of hidden pain, of humanity denied. It is a story erased by history, but not forgotten by those who dare to look deeper. And now, centuries later, by telling their story, we give them what they never had in life, a voice.